So I guess our job for the next half an hour or so is to talk about misinformation and democracy. So it's too bad it's not in the news at all, and there's nothing really to dive into here. But I think more specifically, which that's such a broad topic that we're both pretty interested in, but we want to explore the AI dimension of that. So what is the role that AI is playing in the formation of the platform ecosystem, and more broadly in the character of our public sphere? How is it shaping what we know and who we are able to communicate with and what we receive in our information environment? So Ben, if you haven't read his report, first just a frame, I highly, highly recommend you do. There are very few documents over the last couple of years that have so elegantly crystallized what I think agree is a problem in our digital infrastructure. And Ben, I think that is kind of how you frame it, as actually there's a structural problem in the way our information system is built and designed.
So there's this company, it's called Facebook. You've probably heard of them. They're in the news a lot. Something about the Russians, something about the Trump campaign, dirty tricksters, shady CEOs from a British company, unauthorized access to data, complex manipulation of voters through propaganda. This is the storyline. You would think from reading this narrative that someone has done something illegal. The reality is they have not. These are, by and large, with some exceptions, products functioning as they are intended. We have created a decentralized media system that permits users to select the information that is most interesting and relevant to them. That's the basis of the information revolution known as the internet. It's something that many of us, including myself, celebrated for many years as a democratization of information and media distribution. But what the revolution that has turned another corner with AI. And it's not only just that these tools allow all of you to select whatever information you want and to create your own media diet. The algorithms run by Facebook and Google and Twitter anticipate for you what you like. They look at all the things that you have done in the past, all the comments you've made, all the articles you've liked, your demographic information, and they curate for you a news feed which matches what they believe will keep you on the platform longest. And what happens is that's what keeps you on the platform longest is not consistent with what makes you the most informed voter, is not consistent with what makes you able to judge your own interests when you go to cast a ballot, is not consistent with your understanding of what other people in your society think, is not consistent with this basic concept of a Jeffersonian public sphere that sits at the root of democratic theory, that people come together, they debate the big ideas of the day, they decide what's in their best interests, and they cast a ballot for the parties or candidates who seem to represent those interests. This is not how our modern information system works, dominated by global platforms like Facebook and Google that are primarily there to serve advertisers and not users. And the way that that's done is baked into the structure of the company, and it's at its root is AI. And I think that's the key thing that we want to get into today.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So large-scale data is collected en masse from global populations on platforms. And then it is used inside the platform ecosystem to deliver various services to its various constituencies. What are some of the ways that AI intersects with that data set that is collected and the profiles that are built about users? What kinds of, why don't we just take Facebook, since it seems to be the topic of people's concern right now. How does AI intersect with the various things Facebook does for users and advertisers and publics?
So I'll start with an anecdote. My co-author on Digital Deceit is a former Facebook employee who worked on their privacy team for 2 years. I know him because we served in the Obama administration together. He's a PhD engineer and a specialist on AI. And when we started the research for the paper, I said to him, Dipayan, you know, I was involved in the Obama campaign in 2008, which was at that time wildly heralded as the first presidential campaign that was data-driven, that used the internet effectively to raise money, to organize people, and to do a kind of moneyball politics to figure out which voters to send what messages. I was involved in the 2012 campaign. I was involved in the Hillary campaign in 2016. This is now not just standard, it is central. Every campaign does this all day long, all the time. The budgets on digital media ad spending and data crunching exceed almost every other expenditure for the campaign. What's different now? Why are we talking about this as if it was a crisis? And he said, well, the key thing that you're not seeing is under the hood, the advances in the AI technology between even 2014 and 2016 are L-shaped hockey stick curve of development. And what Facebook is able to do today in terms of identifying and parsing an audience and delivering messages that are designed to draw particular responses is qualitatively different than what it was capable of even a couple of years ago. So what does that mean? So we started thinking about it. Okay, what's the fundamental logic of the Facebook platform? What does it do? How does it curate the news feed? How does it decide what stories you see? And how does it help advertisers find you? It takes all of its audience and it begins to segment it up. Figures out which people believe which ways have homogeneous viewpoints. And then it starts testing messages against them based on all of that data that predicts their preferences. And it sees based on which messages get engagement, which people respond to what things most effectively. And then it begins to feed ads into that match that profile, and it begins to feed news content into that adds that profile times 2 billion. The training set for that AI is greater than any institution currently working in this space. I mean, they have all the money in the world to pay the best engineers to figure out how do you take the largest training data set of any organization in the world and put it to work, carving up audiences into homogeneous groups that are responsive to particular messages. That's become so sophisticated on the Facebook platform that for the first time last year, the amount of money spent on digital ads, largely through Facebook, exceeds the amount of money spent on advertising in all other media forms. The way that begins to become pernicious is when you ask yourself, what is it that keeps me reading on Facebook or keeps me clicking on YouTube videos? And what you get is two things: excessive confirmation bias. I keep clicking and commenting and sharing on the things that reinforce what I already believed. The more times I do that, day after day after day, the more I get segmented into a little echo chamber of people who I'm talking to about the same thing. We all agree. And anytime we're exposed to people who don't believe like us, our response is to heap scorn on them. And to have a shouting match until both sides retreat to their corners.
Which is also engagement, incidentally.
Which is engagement. So when that happens, guess what? Facebook makes money. And the advertisers who sent the ads in that caused those screaming matches on race, on religion, on guns, on immigration, on the most divisive issues in our society, those advertisers make money too. Furthermore, the more engagement your advertisement gets, the less it costs. Facebook gives you a discount because you've done Facebook a favor by keeping people on the platform longer by getting them to engage with your ad.
Which is why Trump ads cost less than Clinton ads.
Correct. So when you have Michelle Obama's quintessential, and in my mind, historic characterization of the race Clinton versus Trump, when they go low, we go high. On Facebook, that just doesn't work. Going high costs more, and it doesn't get the reach or the audience that going low does. Yeah. So there's confirmation bias, there's incivility, there's outrage. Those things work well on social media. Those things drive algorithmic distribution of content into those smaller and smaller echo chambers. The other thing that works is sensationalism. If it bleeds, it leads. It's as old as the media, this idea that the more sensational the content you push, the better. So these are the driving forces that the algorithm is learning maximizes platform participation. And so this is why you have a debate now that says, there's something about this algorithm under the hood at Facebook and Google which is driving polarization in our politics. It's driving a corrosion in the civility of our political discourse. And it's driving a public health crisis as we become addicted to these moving up the outrage ladder, as one behavioral scientist put it, that it's like a drug. The more times you heap scorn on your opponents on Twitter, the more outrageous the thing is that you need next time around to feel the same level of satisfaction. This is a pernicious cycle, and one that is causing all kinds of problems, and I think is the reason why this is for the first time on the front page of the newspaper all the time.
So I want to get to, in a few minutes, to some of the potential policy interventions around this. But first, just a couple things on other dimensions of way AI shapes this space. So you have this interesting phenomenon now in some European countries where real limitations on speech are being placed on platforms. So Germany has a 50,000 euro fine for an act of hate speech that isn't pulled down off a platform, right? And one of the responses I think you're getting from platforms is, okay, well, we will build AI to predict what you think is speech that isn't allowed and automatically pull down content. So it seems like we're getting a bit of a feedback loop here between restrictions on speech from the regulatory side and really AI picking up that role of moderation and preemptively censoring. Can you explain how that's playing out? Is that a problem, or is that this a solution?
So this law that you mentioned in Germany was hotly debated for exactly this reason. Because for the first time, we're transferring the responsibility to decide what is acceptable speech from a publicly elected government to a privately held company. We're saying to Facebook, if you have content on your platform that we later find illegal and you don't pull it down fast enough, we're going to lay a big fine on you. And we're giving them then an incentive to find it in advance using sophisticated AI. But if their AI has false positives and pulls things down that ought not to have been pulled down or would never have been judged illegal by a legal process, you'll never know, because the AI pulled it down before it ever hit your screen. And the creation of an AI-driven content gatekeeper whose terms of decision-making are unknown, non-public, and not subject to public oversight is a scary proposition.
So we might be at the plate of the worst of both worlds, where you both have it opaque and non-human. Yeah.
And I think it is a sort of a path of least resistance, sort of temptation to say, oh, well, if AI got us into this problem, AI can get us out. And it's a simple way to not do the really hard work of changing the business model of very profitable companies, or regulating a sector that has never been regulated before, or having a public debate about whether what we thought was going to be the glorious democratization of media for the internet revolution has actually delivered us some pretty painful negative externalities that we now have to mitigate with aggressive interventions. Those are all hard things to do. It's much easier to say, we're just going to let the smart people at Google and Facebook figure this out. And I don't think that's going to get it done. As
someone said yesterday in response to all this, I can't remember who, but the ethics don't scale efficiently. And there's a real challenge there, right? One other piece of the challenge I think I want to get to is it feels like, from a policy perspective and from an analytic perspective, we often look at what happened over the last couple of years and identify that as the problem, and not kind of look forward to where the smart people building these technologies say it's going, right? And one area that's always amazed me that we're not talking much more about is the whole deep fake concept, where AI is actually being used not just to disseminate pieces of information, but to create pieces of information. Where do you see that conversation going, and actually the creation of reality, not the dissemination of it?
So I think from what I have seen, we're really not that far away from a place where anybody with off-the-shelf software on a PC can create what appears to be a YouTube video of the Prime Minister of Canada saying anything you want him to say.
Yeah.
And you circulate that video on YouTube, and even though later experts might determine that this is a forgery, the damage will long since have been done. And in our current politics of conspiracy theory and massive polarization, we're having a hard enough time explaining to people what real facts are when it's obvious. Say nothing when AI created the forgery and made it not obvious. So I think that the development of AI technologies that create sophisticated forgeries put a greater urgency on us solving this problem right now. And looking at the structural inadequacies of our current information distribution system and understanding, hey, if we don't figure out how to create new norms and expectations of consumer behavior and consumption of information, what's happening now is going to look mild in comparison to what happens in the future. We're going to lose altogether a common basis of fact and national narrative that has long been understood as essential for democratic function. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, in my opinion, and it's going to be it's going to take at least as long to get out of the hole that we're in as it did to dig into it.
So I want to talk a bit about what can be done about this, both from an engineering perspective and a corporate perspective, but also from a government intervention perspective. On the engineering side and on the AI development community side, there's kind of a striking Twitter stream that came out this morning, I guess, from an AI engineer at Google who does deep learning work at Google named François Chollet that you saw, I think. It's leaving aside the fact this comes from a AI developer at a competing media company. I just wanted you to reflect on the responsibility maybe that sits within the development community that he flagged. He said, we're looking at a powerful entity that builds fine-grained psychological profiles of over 2 billion humans, that runs large-scale behavior manipulation experiments, and that aims at developing the best AI technology the world has ever seen. Personally, it really scares me. If you work on AI, please don't help them. Don't play their game. Don't participate in their research ecosystem. Show some conscience. Is that hyperbole, competitive advantage, or kind of an awakening?
I think that's not a cynical play by Google. I think that's probably this guy's actual opinion, and that he sees in his mind a huge difference between the totalitarian panopticon of Google and whatever it is that, of Facebook, and whatever it is that Google is doing. You know, it's a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black, but I think the point that he's making, that we need to stop and have a hard look at what it is that social consequences of these technologies, is right. And we have too long believed that technology and its progress was a net good, full stop. And we are now experiencing some pretty clear evidence that it's not. I mean, I would argue that the disinformation, polarization, manipulation phenomenon that's in the news now is the third great negative externality of the open internet. The first being cybersecurity vulnerability, and the second being mass surveillance. And if those two things weren't enough to persuade us that we need to get serious about bending technology to the will of democracy rather than the other way around, then this latter one ought to be, because if we don't get our hands around disinformation and polarization, we will no longer have the basis of a rational public debate to make decisions that can regulate and structure our information systems in a way that benefits the public. And losing that opportunity, I think, is why this crisis is so urgent.
And it feels like if there wasn't a real governance pushback on those first two waves of externalities, there may be now. Governments are expressing a sense of urgency that I haven't seen in any of those other previous iterations of this. So where do you see, if the problem is structural, both economic and technologically structural, where are the policy interventions that could have the most impact with the least negative consequence?
So I think you start with the simple things. You start by recognizing that most people don't actually understand how these tools work. You open your phone, you open your Facebook, stuff starts flowing across the screen. Significant chunk of Facebook consumers don't see the difference between ads, sponsored content, and the posts from their friends and families and publishers that they follow. We need to change the norms of consumer behavior and expectation. And part of the way you do that is through transparency. You can insist as a government that every ad that appears in a Facebook news feed or that appears before a YouTube video carries a clear disclaimer about who bought the ad, how much engagement that ad has gotten, how many people saw it, and why you're seeing it. What were the demographic characteristics that the advertiser picked out in order to get that ad into your screen? And just by putting that kind of data on the screen, people are going to realize, first, oh, that's an ad, for starters. And second, how do I feel about the fact that that entity is trying to influence me? And who the hell is this entity if I haven't heard of them before? And why do they know so much about me demographically that they can target this ad at me? The vast majority of the users of these tools have no idea that the data that they provide is being used in such a sophisticated way to target ads at them. If we could just begin to create that transparency, I think it takes us in a positive direction. It was an interesting study that I think makes this point, came out of Stanford a few months ago, where their hypothesis was that digital natives, young people who came of age at a time when the internet was the dominant information platform, their hypothesis was that digital natives would be better able to determine fact from fiction online. Turns out exactly the opposite is true. That digital natives are hopeless at distinguishing fact from fiction online, and their conclusion was it's because they don't have a frame of reference from the old media world. When you walk into the newsagent at the airport, there's the real newspapers over here, there's the political magazines over here, there's sports and entertainment, and whether you recognize it or not, in your mind there are categories of different information types. On Facebook, there's just the feed. They're not categorized for you. And if you do not bring that categorization with you to the feed, there's nothing there that's going to provide it for you. How do you recreate the norms of expectation around source verification, around content credibility, around judging what is attempting to make a political point and what is simply reportage? How do you recreate those norms in a digital world? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
So forced transparency is
forced
a policy lever.
transparency is a way forward.
And what about on the data side? How do we the intervention?
The only sensible answer in the short term is we have to restrict the uses of data for the purposes of political manipulation. It's one thing when everything that Facebook knows about you is used to try to steer you towards buying one pair of shoes rather than another. We went through a debate about commercial data privacy 10 years ago, and it turns out not enough people care to make real law on that subject. But now that it's not about shoes and cars and consumer products, now that it's about manipulating your political viewpoint, stoking your prejudices, creating a cycle of outrage that divides you from your neighbors, and separating the polity from a rational public debate that's capsizing democracy, hey, that's something that a lot of people should care about, and I think a lot more people will care about, and I think they'll be willing.
Governments care about that.
Governments care about.
Yeah.
I mean, coming from south of the border, I can tell you it is a huge wake-up call for a lot of people that we now have a government that was elected on an irrational narrative. How do you undo that? How do you go to voters and make a case based on facts and reasoned arguments when you can see that that has not worked in electing candidates? That's a fundamentally disruptive development in our society, and I think limiting the way in which these companies are able to target audiences and to segment audiences for the purpose of political manipulation and communication is a starting point. I think the Europeans are way ahead of us on this, and I think they may try to use their data protection rules immediately to try to do this.
So GDPR, the European data policy that's about to be rolled out, that will affect probably everybody in this room to some capacity, was developed over the past 5 years. Does it have enough foresight built into it to deal with where this problem is going?
In short, no, but the Europeans have a way of interpreting law to match contemporary politics. And I think you will see different member states attempt to use their new data privacy rules to get at this problem. They will be litigated. They will be in court for years. They may end up having to write a new law. But the very fact that it's being debated and creating legal risk for large companies who are in the data business will in and of itself create change. Because at the end, I don't see a scenario where government solves this problem by itself, and I don't see a scenario where the companies solve this problem by themselves. You're going to have both actively participating. That means creating massive pressure on the companies that non-cooperation is going to be penalized in a way that's worse for them than cooperation. And it's going to mean incentivizing governments to act in ways that are risky and which are uncertain in their outcome, which they will only do if there is public pressure for them to do it.
So the last question I want to ask is, I guess, on the politics of this. I think it's fair to say over the course of the Obama administration, there was an evolution of both relationship with Silicon Valley and support for various policies that Silicon Valley may or may not have been in favor of. Obama started his in 2008 as kind of a Twitter candidate and social media candidate, and ended with his last speech warning that Silicon Valley threatened democracy, right? That's a real evolution over the time you were intimately involved with this. I would argue, I think there's a similar change happening in the Canadian government, where Trudeau came to power on a large public engagement on digital platforms, and the government also had a very close relationship with Silicon Valley. With the benefit of hindsight, what advice would you give the Canadian government about how to engage with platforms, engage with Silicon Valley at the right level of distance and with the right level of policy engagement?
I think we have to start by taking the blinders off about techno-utopianism and be honest about the fact that we underestimated the negative externalities of the internet economy. I mean, I was one of those people in the Obama administration who came in and pushed on technological development and universal broadband access and net neutrality and the development of the innovation economy as a key driver of progress, of social progress, of the reduction of inequalities. It was a key part of American foreign policy as a tool of soft power. It continues to be a very important tool of soft power for Americans and for Canadians. But we have to say those things can all be true, but we can't just be blinded by all of these potential benefits and not realize that we're really being undercut on cybersecurity, on mass surveillance, on disinformation, and we're going to need to treat these companies and the markets they've built. They're no longer upstarts who have to be encouraged and protected from red tape and government oversight. They are now some of the dominant corporations, not just in this country or in the US, but in the world. And they have a level of power and influence over social and political developments that is unprecedented and requires firm and immediate public oversight in order to ensure that the results are consistent with the public interest. And right now, we not only haven't been thinking along those lines sufficiently, and we've been surprised and badly injured by that lack of foresight, but we have not got the underlying legal structures or institutions that are ready to deal with it. We're going to have to staff up our public agencies with people who understand these issues well. We're going to have to rethink how laws are applied in order to modify them for the digital world. And those are very difficult tasks, and we don't have a lot of time to do it, because the further down this road we go, the harder it is going to be to unwind it.
Well, thank you so much for the clear-eyed diagnosis. And
it's a very cheery message for lunchtime.
It is. It is.
Be afraid, very afraid.
Step one is recognizing there's a problem, right? Thank you so much.
Pleasure.